She was laughing on the swing 1 second. And gone the next. No scream. No struggle. No footprints leading away. Just a swing still moving in the Alabama heat. For 22 years, investigators believed the truth was inside room 12. But what they uncovered in 2025 would prove the real story had been buried just beyond the fence. A little girl, 2 years old, curly blonde hair, blue eyes, laughing. Her small voice rises above the sound of the insects, above the hum of the road, above the quiet settling of a summer night. She is laughing. She is right there. She is alive. And then she is not. You look away for half a second. Maybe less. And when you look back, the swing is still moving. Back and forth, the old chains creaking against the metal frame. But the seat is empty. And the laughter is gone. And no matter how many times you call her name, no matter how many flashlights sweep through the woods, no matter how many deputies show up, no matter how many years go by, that little girl does not come back. Her name was ALYSSA CAIN. She was 2 years old. And on a humid August night in 2003, she disappeared from the playground of the Silver Pines Motel in northern Alabama, in what would become one of the most baffling, most heartbreaking, and most haunting missing child cases in the history of that state. No body was ever found. No arrest was ever made. No confession. No trial. Nothing but a family shattered, a community left breathless, and a case file that sat in a detective's desk drawer for more than 2 decades. Today, we are going to walk through every single piece of this story. We are going to go back to that night. We are going to sit with the timeline, the inconsistencies, the witnesses, the theories, and the silence that swallowed this case whole. We are going to talk about the parents who became suspects without ever being charged. We are going to talk about the detective who never let go. And we are going to follow this story all the way to the moment, 22 years later, when the darkness finally started to crack. Stay with me. Because this one is going to stay with you. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If you have ever believed that the truth eventually finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes, no matter how deep it gets buried, then subscribe, like, comment, and share this video right now. Share it before you even finish watching. Because cold cases like this one live and die on whether people keep talking about them. The moment the world stops paying attention is the moment the guilty stop worrying. So share this. Post it. Send it to someone. And then come back, because we are just getting started, and what I am about to tell you does not get easier from here. The town where Derek and Melissa had settled was not remarkable in any way that would catch a stranger's eye. It sat in the middle of that wide stretch of Mid-South geography where everything feels slightly out of focus, close enough to Nashville to know it exists, far enough away to feel the distance on a daily basis. The kind of place where people knew their neighbors by first name, and the diner on the main street had been open since before anyone who worked there was born. Where the high school football team's autumn season was a legitimate community event, and where a bad year at the local plant could affect half the families in town at once. Ordinary, in other words, in all the ways that ordinary can be both a comfort and a trap. Derek had grown up not far from there himself, which was part of why they had ended up in the area. His family, a mother who worked at a pharmacy, a father who drove a delivery truck until a back injury retired him early, had given him what they had, which was enough to get started but not quite enough to get ahead. He had been a decent student, athletic enough to play on the baseball team for 2 years in high school, not quite talented enough to play beyond it. He had gone straight from high school into the workforce, picking up the mechanic's trade partly through an uncle who ran a small garage and partly through the kind of stubborn, hands-on learning that comes from taking apart things you cannot afford to have someone else fix. He was good at it. Good enough that for a while, it looked like it might be the foundation of something stable. Melissa had come from a slightly different world. Her family was from Tennessee too, but closer to the city, closer to the kind of opportunities that proximity to a larger economy provides. She had done 2 years at a community college before meeting Derek, had been studying business administration with the vague intention of becoming something professional, though she had not quite settled on what. Meeting Derek had interrupted that plan in the way that meeting someone in your early 20s often interrupts plans, not through force or manipulation, but through the gravitational pull of a relationship that feels, in those early months, like the most important thing in the world. She had put the degree on hold. She had followed him back to his home territory. She had built a life around him and the life they were making together, and for a while, it had been enough. By the summer of 2003, though, the enough had worn thin. The gambling had been going on for a while, longer than Melissa had initially understood, because the particular genius of a gambling problem is its concealment, the way it hides inside ordinary financial chaos until the ordinary chaos becomes something else. She had suspected, then known, then confronted, and the confrontations had produced the temporary improvements and the eventual backslidings that are the rhythm of any addiction. She had not given up immediately. She was not a person who gave up immediately on anything. But by the time they loaded the car for Texas, she was closer to the end of her patience than Derek perhaps realized. Alyssa, for her part, knew none of this. She knew the texture of her mother's voice and the shape of her father's laugh and the particular comfort of her pink stuffed rabbit. She knew the way the morning light came through the curtains in her bedroom and the taste of applesauce and the specific joy of being pushed on a swing. She was 2 years old. She was loved. And she was at the beginning of everything. To understand what happened at the Silver Pines Motel, you have to understand the world that ALYSSA CAIN was born into. She was the only child of Derek and Melissa CAIN, a young couple in their late 20s who had settled in Tennessee, not far from the Alabama border. By most accounts, they were an ordinary working-class family trying to hold things together the way ordinary working-class families do, through routine and stubbornness and the quiet hope that tomorrow would be easier than today. Derek worked as a mechanic. He had been doing it for years, the kind of job that leaves grease under your fingernails and a dull ache in your lower back by Friday afternoon, but it was steady work, and he knew it. Melissa worked part-time and spent the rest of her time taking care of Alyssa, who by the summer of 2003 had just crossed the threshold into her second year on Earth. She was at that stage where everything is enormous and everything is funny and the world is one long series of things worth laughing at. Curly blonde hair. Blue eyes the color of a clear afternoon sky. A laugh that her mother said could cut right through the worst day you ever had. The marriage, by all accounts, had seen better days. People who knew them would later describe the relationship as volatile. Not violent, at least not in any way that ever made it into a police report, but strained. Tense. The kind of quiet that builds in a house when two people have stopped being careful with each other. Derek had recently lost his job at the garage where he'd worked for years. The reasons were never made fully public, but the result was a household leaning hard on whatever savings they had, and on whatever credit they could still access. There was gambling debt too, according to investigators who would later dig through their financial records. Not enormous, but enough to cause friction. Enough to mean the money was never where it was supposed to be. Melissa's sister would later tell investigators that Melissa had been talking about leaving. Not in the dramatic, explosive way that ends marriages in a single night, but in that slow, sorrowful way where someone starts saying out loud what they've been thinking for a long time. She said she was thinking about moving on. She said the marriage wasn't working. She hadn't done anything about it yet, but the words were already out in the world, and words like that have a weight to them that doesn't just disappear. So when Derek and Melissa packed up their car on that August morning in 2003 and pointed it southwest toward Texas, they were doing what struggling families do, they were moving towards something easier, even if just for a little while. They were going to visit family. Melissa's relatives on the other side of the state line, people who would be happy to see them, who would feed them and give them a few days of not having to think about the debt or the tension or the things that had gone unsaid for too long. Alyssa was strapped into her car seat in the back, and whatever else was wrong in that family, at least for the first few hours on the road, everything probably felt like it was going to be okay. They drove for hours. The kind of driving that numbs you. Highway after highway unspooling into the distance, the same fast food signs repeating every 50 miles, the same radio stations slowly fading into static and being replaced by new ones. Alyssa fell asleep somewhere along the way, her tiny hand wrapped around a worn pink stuffed rabbit that she apparently carried everywhere. The toy had been washed so many times it had gone soft and shapeless, but she loved it the way only a 2-year-old can love something, completely, without reservation, without any awareness that it was just a thing. By the time evening settled over northern Alabama, they were tired. The good kind of tired that comes from being in motion all day, but tired nonetheless. They needed a place to stop. And that is how they found the Silver Pines Motel. If you had driven Highway 41 in northern Alabama in 2003, you might have seen it, a roadside motel of the kind that used to dot every American highway before the chain hotels took over. A faded blue neon sign out front, chipped paint on the exterior walls, a small parking lot that wrapped around the property. In its better years, it had probably been a perfectly decent place to sleep for the night. By the summer of 2003, it had drifted from decent into tired. The furniture in the rooms was old. The carpet smelled faintly of things you didn't want to think too hard about. The security cameras were ancient, grainy black and white units mounted under the eaves, and at least one of them had been broken for months, according to the manager. But it had a bed. And it had a parking lot. And behind the main building, it had a small playground, a rusted swing set with 2 seats, a cracked plastic slide, and a patch of gravel that the local kids probably hadn't used in years. For a family with a 2-year-old who had been sitting in a car seat for most of the day, that playground was enough. The whole place was enough. It was just a place to rest. The manager of the Silver Pines at the time was a heavy-set man in his late 50s named Carl Jennings. He had run the motel for years. He knew the regulars, the long-haul truck drivers who stopped through every couple of weeks, the families heading south for the summer, the occasional couple passing through without much to say about where they were going. He checked Derek and Melissa in without much ceremony. Room 12. End of the row. He gave them the key and went back to whatever he had been doing. Melissa carried Alyssa inside while Derek dealt with the car. Room 12 smelled the way those rooms always smelled, of old carpet cleaner and the ghost of 100 previous guests and something underneath all of that you could never quite name. But Alyssa was still half asleep, limp and warm against her mother's shoulder, and Melissa laid her down on the bed and smoothed her hair back from her forehead and stood there for a moment just watching her breathe. The way parents do. The way you do when you know, somewhere in the back of your mind, that these small moments are the whole point. Derek came in and set down the bags. They talked about getting something to eat. About how much further it was to Texas. About whether Alyssa would sleep through the night or whether she'd be up and restless by midnight. Ordinary conversation. The background noise of an ordinary evening. And then Alyssa stirred, and opened her eyes, and started to move, and suddenly she was awake and wanted to go outside. Melissa decided to take her to the playground. It was still warm out, the kind of warmth that lingers in Alabama long after dark, and Alyssa had been still for hours. She needed to move. Needed to run. Needed to do what 2-year-olds do when you finally let them out of a car, burn through the energy that has been building all day like steam in a closed pot. Derek said he would grab a few things from the car, get some ice from the vending machine, maybe take a few minutes to decompress. And so the 3 of them went their separate ways for what should have been no more than 15 or 20 minutes. Melissa walked Alyssa across the gravel toward the playground. The porch lights buzzed overhead, circled by moths. The highway hummed at the edge of the property. Somewhere in the dark, crickets and cicadas kept up their constant conversation. Alyssa laughed at something, maybe a frog, maybe her own shadow, maybe nothing at all, and ran ahead across the gravel in the way toddlers run, all momentum and no steering. She climbed onto the swing and called for her mother to push her. When you look back at the transcript of Melissa's 911 call, made by a motel guest on her behalf while she was still at the playground, the texture of her voice in those first minutes is something that has stayed with every investigator who listened to it. There is a particular quality to a person's voice when the thing they are experiencing has not yet fully become real to them, a kind of bright, rapid edge to the speech, words coming out in bursts, the mind cycling through the same information again and again as if repetition might produce a different result. She said Alyssa's name at least 11 times in the first 90 seconds of the call. Not screaming, at that point. Something worse than screaming. The tone of someone who is just barely holding on to the possibility that this is still a misunderstanding. The dispatcher on the other end of the call did what dispatchers are trained to do, stayed calm, asked specific questions, kept Melissa focused enough to provide the information that the responding officers would need. What was the child wearing? A pink shirt, blue shorts, white shoes with Velcro straps. How long had she been missing? A minute, maybe 2, Melissa kept saying. Maybe less. She was right there and then she was gone. Where exactly? The playground, the one behind the building, next to the parking lot. Is anyone else searching? A few guests. Her husband was looking but she didn't know where. It was that last detail, she didn't know where her husband was, that planted the first small seed of questions in the mind of the dispatcher, and later in the minds of the investigators who reviewed the tape. Not because it was necessarily suspicious. People lose track of each other in a crisis. People split up and run in different directions when panic takes hold. But in the careful architecture of a missing child investigation, every detail matters, and the detail of a father unaccounted for in the first moments is something you note and return to. By the time the first deputy pulled into the Silver Pines parking lot, the scene had the quality of barely controlled chaos that first responders recognize immediately, the kind of situation that has been going on long enough for panic to set in but not long enough for any structure to have formed around it. People were moving in multiple directions without coordination. Flashlights were swinging wildly. The sound of Melissa calling Alyssa's name had taken on the hoarse, cracking quality of a voice that had already been through something and was not yet done. The deputy parked and got out and started trying to establish who was in charge of what, which is harder to do than it sounds when you are dealing with a collection of people who are running on fear. Derek appeared from somewhere in the parking lot about 40 seconds after the first deputy arrived. His appearance was noted, the pallor, the pacing, the fractured quality of his speech as he tried to explain what had happened. He told the same story he would tell 100 times over the next several days. He had gone to the trunk, grabbed some bags, walked to the vending machine, walked back. A few minutes, maybe 10. He kept going back to the number. 5, 10 minutes, he said, like the repetition was an anchor. Like if he said it enough times it would stop being something anyone could question. Melissa walked over and gave the seat a gentle nudge. It creaked, the old chains groaning against the metal frame, and Alyssa laughed again. Back and forth. Back and forth. The night was warm and ordinary and quiet. Melissa stood there watching her daughter swing, thinking the kinds of thoughts parents think when they finally have a moment to just stand still, about how quickly she was growing, about how different she seemed from just a few months ago, about how these small evening moments were the ones she was going to remember when everything else had faded. And then, from somewhere behind her, a car door slammed. Someone in the parking lot laughed. Something ordinary, something that barely registered. Melissa turned to glance toward the sound. 1 second. Maybe 2. When she looked back, the swing was still moving. But Alyssa was gone. There is a specific, terrible quality to the moment when a parent first realizes that their child is not where they are supposed to be. It is not panic, not yet. It is something that comes before panic. A kind of wrongness, a cognitive hiccup, the mind trying to reconcile what the eyes are seeing with what cannot possibly be true. Melissa stood there for a beat, just looking at the empty swing. Still moving. Back and forth. And then she started scanning the playground, the area behind the slide, the edge of the gravel, the grass beyond the fence, because of course Alyssa was just there. Of course she had just climbed off the swing and wandered 2 feet to the left while Melissa wasn't looking. Of course. But she wasn't there. Behind the slide, nothing. Past the fence, nothing. At the edge of the gravel, nothing. Melissa called her name. Once, the way you do when you're not really alarmed yet, just letting the child know you're looking. Then again, louder. Then louder still. And the longer the silence held, the more the wrongness grew, filling her chest the way cold water fills a room, quickly, completely, without any way to stop it. She ran toward the swing, calling out. She pushed through the grass at the edge of the playground, calling out. She circled back around, eyes sweeping the dark in every direction, calling out. And from somewhere across the parking lot, Derek heard her voice, heard the change in it, that particular edge that doesn't sound like anything else in the world, and he came out of the shadows and found her kneeling in the dirt, clawing through the bushes, saying the same thing over and over. She was just right here. I looked away for 1 second. She was just right here. Within minutes, the entire motel was in motion. Guests appeared in doorways, drawn by the sound of a mother screaming her child's name. Flashlights came out from glove compartments and nightstands. Strangers who had never met each other spread out across the property, calling out a name they had just learned. Someone sprinted to the front office and told Carl Jennings to call 911. Derek ran from room to room, pounding on doors, his voice cracking, demanding to know if anyone had seen a little girl, blonde hair, 2 years old, pink shirt. She was just at the playground. Did you see her? Did anyone see her? The answer, every time, was no. Sheriff's deputies arrived just after 9 in the evening. What they found when they pulled into the Silver Pines parking lot was controlled chaos, motel guests with flashlights sweeping through the dark, Carl Jennings standing at the office door wringing his hands, and Alyssa Cain near the swing set, trembling, her hands caked with dirt from where she had torn through the bushes herself. Derek stood nearby, pale and pacing in circles, his voice breaking every time he repeated the same words. It's impossible. She was right here. How is this possible? The first deputies on the scene did what first deputies always do in a situation like this. They moved quickly and they tried to control what could be controlled. They established a perimeter around the playground. They started taking names. They got on the radio. And they looked at Melissa and Derek Cain with the particular, careful attention that law enforcement always gives to the parents in these situations, because the statistics are what they are, and the statistics are ugly, and deputies who have been doing this job for any length of time know that the hardest part of missing child cases is that the answer is often already standing right in front of you. But first, they had to find the child. Everything else could come later. They checked the immediate area. The dumpsters behind the maintenance shed. The culverts along the edge of the property. The shallow drainage ditch that ran along the tree line. A canine unit arrived around midnight, the dog's handler pressing Alyssa's stuffed rabbit to its nose before letting it work the ground. For a brief, electrifying moment, the dog caught a scent, moving from the playground toward the rear fence, angling toward the tree line. The handler kept pace, heart pounding. And then the trail went dead. Just beyond the gravel lot, past the fence, the scent simply stopped. No tire marks in the soft earth. No footprints in the mud. Nothing to suggest that a person had passed through carrying a child. Nothing at all. Deputies questioned every guest at the motel that night. Most were long-haul truck drivers or families passing through, the kind of people who keep to themselves and move on before sunrise. Nobody recalled seeing a stranger near the playground. Nobody had noticed anyone paying unusual attention to the family. One woman, a guest in room 7, mentioned that she'd heard a car peel out of the parking lot sometime around 8:30, accelerating fast, she said, the way someone does when they're in a hurry. She hadn't seen which direction it went. Another guest, a man traveling alone, said he thought he might have heard a child crying at some point in the evening, but he couldn't say for certain whether the sound had come from the playground or from one of the other rooms. Children crying in motel rooms was not unusual. He hadn't paid it much attention. By 2 in the morning, the sheriff himself was on site. The night had cooled somewhat, a low fog rolling in across the asphalt, and the property was lit up with the harsh white light of portable floodlamps. Melissa refused to go inside. She sat on the curb near the playground, wrapped in a motel blanket someone had brought her, her eyes never leaving the swing. It was still now. The chains hung slack. Derek hovered nearby, answering every question the deputies put to him, his voice falling apart each time he had to repeat the timeline. He'd been gone to the vending machine. He'd been in the trunk getting their bags. He'd been 5 minutes, maybe 10. He wasn't sure. It was all happening so fast. But it wasn't just Derek's timeline that was beginning to feel uncertain. The more investigators worked through the sequence of events, the more the whole evening seemed to resist being pinned down. Memories were slipping. Details were shifting. And somewhere in those shifts was either the truth or a very careful lie. The science of searching for a missing person is more complicated than most people understand. When you are looking for an adult who has gone missing voluntarily, the parameters are different from when you are looking for an adult taken against their will, which is different again from when you are looking for a small child. Children move differently from adults, disperse differently, make different choices about where to go and why. A 2-year-old who has wandered away on their own will typically not go far, their legs are short, their attention is easily captured, and they have not yet developed the capacity to make directed decisions about destination. They wander toward whatever interests them and stop when they get interested in something else. They do not have the cognitive architecture to make a plan and execute it. Which meant that if Alyssa had wandered away from that playground on her own, if she had simply climbed off the swing and walked into the dark while her mother's head was turned, she should have been found within the first hour. She should have been sitting behind a bush chasing a frog, or asleep under a tree, or crying by the edge of the highway frightened by the noise of the trucks. The fact that the K9 unit's trail went dead at the fence, the fact that there was no second footprint beyond that single impression in the packed dirt, the fact that no guest and no passing driver had seen a small child moving alone along the road, all of this pointed away from the wandering hypothesis from very early on. The investigators knew it. They did not say it publicly. But they knew it. The alternative hypotheses were darker and more difficult. The first was abduction by a stranger, someone who had been watching the playground, who had moved with extraordinary speed and precision in the seconds that Melissa's attention was elsewhere, who had scooped up a child and removed her from the area so quickly and so completely that not a single person in that parking lot had registered what happened. The problem with this hypothesis was not that it was impossible. Stranger abductions do occur, and occasionally they occur in exactly this kind of opportunistic, rapid way, but that it required an implausible density of favorable conditions. The timing would have had to be perfect. The perpetrator would have had to be in exactly the right position, moving at exactly the right moment, without being seen by any of the multiple witnesses in the general area. Possible. But requiring a lot of things to go exactly right in a very short window. The second dark hypothesis was the one that investigators began, reluctantly and carefully, to take more seriously as the hours passed, that Alyssa had not disappeared from the playground at all, not in the way the story presented. That the disappearance had been staged. That something had happened to Alyssa before anyone said it had, in circumstances that were not public, and that what was presented as a sudden vanishing from a playground was actually the final act of a cover story constructed around a reality that was too terrible to be told directly. Staging is not uncommon in crimes involving harm to children. The psychology of it is brutal but comprehensible. A person who has done something irreversible, something that cannot be undone, faces a choice between confessing what they have done, with all the consequences that entails, and constructing a story that reframes the known facts in a way that points away from them. The staging does not have to be perfect. It does not have to answer every question. It only has to be good enough to create enough uncertainty that the truth cannot be established beyond a reasonable doubt. If Alyssa had been harmed before the playground story began, then everything that followed, the panic, the searching, the 911 call, the tears, the investigation, was theater built on top of a fact that could not be changed. And the performance only needed to hold until enough time had passed, until enough evidence had been lost or buried or simply worn away by the passage of days, that the real story became irretrievable. It is a grim thing to think about. It is a grimmer thing to investigate. Because investigating the possibility of staging means investigating the grief of a mother and finding out whether it is real or performed, means sitting across from people who may have lost a child and treating their loss as a potential crime scene. The investigators who did this work did not enjoy it. They were not, in the main, people who were quick to assume the worst of parents in crisis. But they had been in this work long enough to know what the numbers said, and the numbers said you could not afford to assume the best, either. When the sun came up over northern Alabama the next morning, the Silver Pines motel was barely recognizable. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the entrance and around the playground. A temporary command post had been established in the parking lot, with folding tables covered in maps and radio equipment. Detectives from surrounding counties were arriving to help. State investigators had been called in overnight. And the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, which was leading the investigation, had every available unit out in the field. Dozens of deputies and volunteers spread out through the dense pine woods behind the motel, moving in lines through the morning fog, calling Alyssa's name into the trees. They checked drainage ditches and culverts and the shallow creek bed that ran through the woods half a mile north. They pushed through underbrush and around fallen timber. They covered ground that hadn't seen a human footprint in years. And they found nothing. Helicopters swept the area from above, their thermal imaging cameras scanning the tree canopy for any sign of a small body, moving or still. Roadblocks went up in both directions along Highway 41, deputies stopping every vehicle and asking every driver if they had seen anything the previous evening, if they had noticed a child, if they had stopped at the Silver Pines. By mid-morning, the roadblocks had produced nothing useful. Every driver checked out. Every story was ordinary. The scent dogs continued to work the property in wide looping circles, but they kept coming back to the same spot, the playground, the swing set, the small patch of gravel where Alyssa had last been seen. The dogs were telling investigators something, but the investigators could not figure out what. It was as if the child had simply evaporated from that swing. As if she had ceased to exist at the edge of the playground and left no trace behind her in any direction. Except for one thing. In those first desperate hours of the search, before the fog lifted and before the foot traffic had thoroughly churned up every inch of the property, one of the officers paused at the rear fence of the playground. He had been there before, the night before, in the dark. But now, in the early morning light, he could see things he had missed. He crouched down beside the fence and looked at the earth just beyond it, where the gravel lot gave way to a narrow strip of packed dirt before the tree line began. And there, pressed into the dirt, was a tiny shoe print. Smaller than his palm. The tread pattern of a child's shoe. Facing the woods. There was only one of them. The print ended there. No second step. No trail. As if ALYSSA CAIN had taken one step beyond the fence and then simply stopped existing. The print was photographed and documented. A plaster cast was made. And then investigators stood around it for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. How does a child take one step and leave no other trace? Where does a 2-year-old go with no footprints, no trail, no witness? How does a human being, even a very small one, vanish so completely from a lit parking lot beside a busy highway that no one saw a thing? There were no good answers. There were only theories, and the theories multiplied as the hours stretched into days and the search found nothing. By mid-morning of the first full day, detectives had begun to pull back from the pure search and rescue posture and lean harder into the investigative side of things. They still had teams in the woods. But they also had the parents, and the parents were becoming the most complicated part of the picture. Carl Jennings, the motel manager, told investigators something that shifted the mood of the entire inquiry. He said that before Alyssa disappeared, before the family had even gone out to the playground, he had heard Derek and Melissa arguing. Loud enough, he said, that a guest had complained. He could not make out the specific words, but the tone was unmistakable, two people in the middle of something serious. And he said Derek had been the one to leave, storming out of room 12 and walking out into the parking lot, while Melissa stayed inside with the child. That detail did not match the version Melissa had given. According to her, they had both been in the room together when she decided to take Alyssa outside. According to Carl, Derek had already been outside, and for how long, nobody could say. Investigators took note. They didn't run with it yet. But they took note. The security camera footage was retrieved and reviewed again, this time more carefully. The cameras were old, their resolution so poor that faces were barely distinguishable, and the angles were wrong for the playground. But investigators could see Melissa and Alyssa walking across the lot toward the playground. They could see the outline of a small child. And then the footage showed nothing. No one else moving in the area around the playground. No vehicle pulling up. No shadow crossing the frame at the wrong moment. Just a woman and a child walking toward a swing set, and then nothing. When the cadaver dogs arrived on the second night, the mood among investigators shifted further. Cadaver dogs are not the same as tracking dogs. They are not looking for a living person. They are looking for the chemical signature of human decomposition. The decision to bring them in was not made lightly. It meant someone on that task force had already started to believe, at least privately, that they might not be looking for a missing child anymore. They might be looking for something else entirely. The dogs swept the property methodically. And around midnight of the second night, one of them alerted near the large dumpster behind the maintenance shed. The handler signaled. The area was sealed. Floodlights blazed. Technicians suited up and began working through the contents of that dumpster by hand, pulling out every bag, sorting through every layer of refuse, working with the careful, grim thoroughness of people who understood what they might be about to find. Hours later, they had nothing. The contents of the dumpster were ordinary motel waste, food containers, cleaning supplies, discarded items from guest rooms. Whatever had caused the dog to alert was most likely old meat or decomposed food. It happened. It was not a definitive result. But it left everyone in that parking lot shaken and unsteady. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, a man who lived about half a mile down the road from the motel called the sheriff's department. He said he'd been sitting on his porch the previous evening when he saw a white sedan accelerating away from the direction of the Silver Pines around 8:30. Fast, he said. Moving like someone who had somewhere urgent to be, or someone who was trying to put distance between themselves and something. He couldn't get a plate number. He couldn't describe the driver. But the image had stayed with him, the headlights cutting hard through the fog, the engine sound rising as the car found speed. Detectives spread out across the area, canvassing local garages and gas stations, asking about white sedans, about anything unusual. They checked stolen vehicle reports and ran registrations on every white sedan in the county. Nothing came back that connected to the motel or the Cain family. One of the things that investigators do in the early stages of a missing child case, when the parents are still nominally victims rather than suspects, is ask them to submit to polygraph examinations. The polygraph is not admissible in court, and most investigators will tell you privately that it is not particularly reliable as a scientific instrument. But it is useful as an investigative tool, because the responses of innocent people and guilty people to the process tend to differ in ways that experienced examiners can read, not the results themselves, necessarily, but the willingness to participate, the demeanor during the examination, the specific patterns of response to specific questions. Both Derek and Melissa were asked about polygraph examinations in the early stages of the investigation. The details of their responses to that request, and of any examinations that may or may not have been conducted, are not part of the public record of this case. What is known is that the investigators who worked the original inquiry came away from the early interview stages with questions that were not satisfied by the explanations they received. The financial picture that emerged from the background investigation was particularly troubling, not because debt and financial pressure are evidence of anything by themselves, but because they provided context for the kind of desperation that sometimes leads people to choices they would not otherwise make. Derek owed money to individuals rather than institutions, personal debts of the kind that carry social pressure beyond the purely financial. The loss of his job had not been clean. There had been circumstances around it that people who knew him mentioned in vague terms, circumstances that suggested the departure had been less than amicable, that there had been something said or done that made going back impossible. And Melissa's expressed intention to leave the marriage, to take Alyssa and go, that detail hung in the air of the investigation like smoke. Because a child is leverage. A child is the one thing that keeps people connected even after everything else has broken apart. A child is what you fight over when there is nothing left to fight over but each other. And the removal of a child, the permanent, irreversible removal of a child, changes the equation entirely. It takes away the leverage. It eliminates the point of contention. It resolves, in the most final possible way, the question of who gets to keep what. The investigators who were thinking along these lines were careful, extremely careful, not to let that thinking run ahead of the evidence. The analysis was a framework for understanding what might have happened, not a conclusion about what did. A parent who harms a child to prevent a custody situation is an extremely dark reading of events, one that requires a particular kind of psychology that not every person who is going through a difficult divorce possesses. Most people who face the dissolution of a marriage and the prospect of shared custody of a child do not resort to anything more than lawyers and argument and the ordinary, painful machinery of family court. The investigators knew this. But they also knew that sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the machinery of ordinary dissolution breaks down completely, and what happens next is something that cannot be undone. What the investigators did not have, could not get, was anything concrete. Nothing that would stand up. They believed certain things. They had reasons for believing them. But belief, in the criminal justice system, is not currency. Evidence is currency. And the evidence was not there. By the end of the second day, the command post was running on caffeine and fear. The sheriff was holding briefings every few hours. The search teams in the woods had found no clothing, no shoe, no toy, no trace. The interviews had produced inconsistencies but no confessions. The physical evidence was essentially non-existent. And the case, which had been explosive and urgent and consuming from the moment the first deputy arrived, was beginning to settle into something colder and harder and more dangerous, the kind of case where the window for answers starts to close, and the people who know what happened start to feel safer keeping silent. When you work a missing child case, the parents are always part of the picture. That is not cruelty. That is statistics. The ugly, terrible reality of what happens to children who go missing is that in a significant portion of those cases, someone known to the child is responsible. Investigators are trained to hold that possibility open from the very beginning, even while they are doing everything possible to find the child, even while they are sitting across from a mother who is crying and shaking and asking them to please find her little girl. You hold it open. You watch. And you listen. Detectives from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office separated Derek and Melissa Cain for formal questioning on the afternoon following the disappearance. They were taken to different rooms, questioned by different teams, and their answers were compared against each other and against the physical timeline investigators had been building since the night before. Melissa's interview was wrenching to observe, by most accounts. She was distraught from the beginning, crying, barely coherent at moments, stopping to compose herself and then falling apart again, answering questions between sobs. She went through the evening in detail. The drive. The motel. The room. The playground. The swing. She told them everything, or said she did, and her grief appeared total and real. But as the hours stretched on and the questions continued and the investigators came back around again and again to the same moments, her demeanor began to shift. The tears dried up. The sobs quieted. She grew very still. She answered questions in shorter sentences. Her eyes, which had been searching and wet and full of visible pain, went somewhere else. Not hostile. Not defensive. Just vacant. As if she had reached the bottom of something and there was nothing left. Some of the investigators would later say, in interviews and depositions, that the shift unsettled them more than the tears had. Grief runs out. Everyone who has ever sat with a grieving person knows that at some point the body simply stops producing the outward signs of it, even when the grief itself is real and raw and nowhere near finished. But to the trained eye of an investigator watching carefully for signs of deception, the transition from desperate emotion to a kind of flat calm can look like something else. It can look like someone who has finished performing. Derek's interview had a different texture. He was restless throughout. He sat in the chair but couldn't stay still in it, his leg bouncing, his hands moving, his eyes never quite landing anywhere for too long. He went through the evening the same way Melissa had, the drive, the motel, the room, but when investigators got to the part where he had left to go to the vending machine and the car, things got complicated. Derek said he had been gone for 5 minutes. Maybe 10. He wasn't sure. He had gone to the trunk to get some things, then walked to the vending machine on the far side of the lot to get some ice, then walked back to the room. Simple. Quick. Ordinary. But the motel's front office clerk, a young woman who had been working the desk that evening, remembered seeing Derek. And she placed him near the vending machine much later than he claimed, closer to 8:40, she said, which was almost 15 minutes later than Derek's own account suggested. When investigators asked Derek about the discrepancy, he couldn't explain it. He said it was all a blur. He said he didn't know. He said maybe he had been out longer than he thought, maybe he had stopped to talk to someone, maybe he had just lost track of time. Maybe. The problem with maybe, in a missing child investigation, is that maybe is where guilty people live. Not all of them, and not always. But the gap between Derek's timeline and the clerk's recollection was exactly the window in which Alyssa had disappeared. Those 15 minutes were the entire space in which everything had gone wrong. And Derek couldn't account for them. Couldn't place himself anywhere specific. Couldn't produce a single moment of verifiable, documentable activity to fill that time. Investigators didn't charge him. They didn't have enough. But the gap sat at the center of everything from that point forward, a hole in the story that nothing could fill. As the investigation expanded, the background checks on Derek and Melissa began to come back. What they revealed was a picture that complicated the narrative of the heartbroken couple. Derek's gambling debts were more significant than they had initially appeared. He owed money to people who were not patient creditors. His job loss had been more recent than anyone had known, and more abrupt. There were suggestions that the circumstances of his departure from the garage were not entirely straightforward, though investigators were never able to develop that particular thread into anything specific. Melissa's sister, interviewed separately, painted a portrait of a marriage that had been deteriorating for some time. She described arguments that went beyond ordinary friction. She talked about a woman who had grown afraid of her own life, afraid of what she had built with this man, afraid of where it was going. She said Melissa had told her, not long before the trip to Texas, that she was thinking about leaving for good. That she was planning to take Alyssa and go. That she was done. Whether that context was cause or coincidence, whether it was relevant to what happened in that parking lot or completely beside the point, was something investigators spent years trying to determine. The sister's account was compelling. But it was not evidence. It was one person's interpretation of a private conversation, filtered through grief and suspicion and whatever her own feelings about Derek might have been. It did not prove anything. It just made the picture darker. What investigators needed was physical evidence. A body. A witness. A piece of clothing. Something they could take to a courtroom and put in front of a jury. Without that, they had a story full of uncomfortable shadows and unanswered questions and a child who was simply gone. By the third day after Alyssa's disappearance, the Silver Pines Motel had become a media spectacle. Local television stations had been there from the beginning, setting up their cameras outside the yellow tape and filing live reports every few hours. But by day 3, the national outlets had arrived. Satellite trucks lined the highway. Reporters stood in front of the rusted playground and delivered their segments in the particular breathless register that television journalism uses for this kind of story. A 2-year-old girl vanished from a motel playground in rural Alabama. No leads. No suspects. No body. Her photograph, the one her parents had given to investigators on that first night, a smiling toddler in pink overalls with curly blonde hair and eyes the color of an afternoon sky, was on every screen in the country. Flyers went up at gas stations and grocery stores and truck stops across 3 states. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children issued an alert. Tip lines rang constantly, fielded by dispatchers who did their best to sort the credible from the desperate from the outright delusional. Because when a missing child case goes national, the tips do not stop coming, and the vast majority of them are wrong. There were sightings, of course. There are always sightings. A truck driver somewhere near Memphis called in to say he thought he'd seen a little girl matching Alyssa's description at a rest stop, sitting in the cab of a car he didn't recognize. Investigators responded immediately, pulled surveillance footage, interviewed everyone they could find at that rest stop. The little girl turned out to be the daughter of a family from Georgia who was traveling with her parents and her older sister and was doing just fine. A woman in Louisiana called to say she had seen Alyssa Cain at a gas station 2 days after the disappearance, accompanied by a small blonde child who was not Alyssa. Investigators checked the time stamp on the surveillance footage from that gas station and determined that Melissa had been sitting in an interview room with 2 detectives at the exact moment the woman claimed to have seen her. The tip was worthless. They all were. But the public pressure on the investigation was immense, and the attention was not entirely useless. It kept Alyssa's face in front of people who might actually know something. It kept the story alive. And it generated, in the background of all the noise, the kind of low-level ambient surveillance that sometimes produces results, someone who hadn't thought to call because they didn't realize what they'd seen until they saw the name on the news, someone who had been hesitant to get involved until they understood what was at stake. Unfortunately, in this case, no one like that ever came forward. The media attention also did something else. It turned the public eye on Derek and Melissa Cain in a way that made their lives increasingly difficult. Talk radio hosts speculated openly about the parents' involvement, using the language of maybe and it seems like and it makes you wonder in ways that stopped just short of accusation but landed close enough. Online forums dug up whatever they could find about the family, Derek's job loss, the gambling debts, the suggestion of marital trouble, and assembled it into narratives that were not exactly true but were not entirely false either. Some people were certain Derek had done something. Others were certain it was Melissa. Some forums circulated theories about trafficking networks using rural motels as collection points, and while investigators were required to take even the most improbable leads seriously, they found no evidence to support any of it. The couple's behavior in the weeks following the disappearance made things worse in the court of public opinion. Melissa stopped talking to the press entirely. She refused to do televised appeals for information, refused to sit in front of a camera and beg whoever had her daughter to bring her home, and that refusal read, to many people watching from the outside, as something other than grief. People expected a certain kind of performance from parents in this situation. They expected tears and public appeals and the particular raw desperation that says, undeniably, this person is suffering. When Melissa withdrew instead, when she went quiet and unreachable, people filled in the gap with suspicion. The behavioral analysis that the FBI unit produced was not, it should be understood, a document that anyone in the sheriff's department was entirely comfortable receiving. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes with having a federal agency tell you formally what you have already been thinking informally. It makes the thinking real in a way it wasn't before, makes it official, makes it something you have to act on rather than something you can keep in the category of private suspicion. The profilers who worked the Cain case were experienced practitioners of a discipline that sits somewhere between science and art. Behavioral analysis, the practice of building profiles of offenders and predicting their likely characteristics based on the nature of their crimes, has a complicated relationship with empirical science. It is more reliable in some applications than others. It is better at narrowing fields of candidates than at identifying specific individuals. And it is, at its best, a tool for directing investigative attention rather than a substitute for evidence. In the Cain case, the behavioral analysis was specifically directed at the question of what kind of event had most likely produced the outcome of a missing 2-year-old with no trace. The profilers worked through the categories systematically. Stranger abduction was considered and largely discounted on the basis of the physical evidence, the witness landscape, and the probability distribution of such events. Parental abduction, the possibility that Derek had taken Alyssa somewhere and hidden her with the intention of using her as leverage in the anticipated custody dispute, was considered but also largely discounted, primarily because the absence of any sighting or contact was inconsistent with a child who was being kept alive. And that left the darkest option. The profilers' conclusion, carefully worded but unmistakable in its direction, was that the evidence was most consistent with harm having occurred to Alyssa before or at the time of the reported disappearance, with the playground scene representing a reconstruction rather than a documentation of the actual sequence of events. They noted that the staging, if it had occurred, had been imperfect, the footprint, the canine trail that went dead at the fence, the timeline inconsistencies, but also that the imperfections had been sufficient to prevent investigators from establishing anything definitive. The staging had worked. Not completely, not in the sense of permanently resolving the question, but well enough to prevent any arrest. The profilers also noted something about the couple's behavior in the weeks and months following the disappearance that they found significant. Not the public behavior, the refusal of interviews, the withdrawn demeanor, but the private behavior, the pattern of how they interacted with each other and with investigators in settings that were not public-facing. They described it as consistent with two people who were managing a shared secret rather than two people experiencing the same grief independently. The way their stories aligned at certain points and diverged at others. The specific places where their accounts were identical, word for word, in ways that suggested prior coordination. The specific places where they contradicted each other, which were never the places that mattered most. It was, the profilers said, a picture of people who were telling a story rather than remembering an experience. And while that distinction is not admissible in court, and while the profilers were careful to acknowledge that their conclusions were probabilistic rather than definitive, the people who read that report came away from it changed. They came away from it looking at the Cain case, and at Derek and Melissa Cain, differently from how they had looked at it before. And that change in perspective, even though it produced no immediate action, planted a seed that would take a long time to grow into anything. Derek gave one interview to a local television station, sitting in a chair that seemed too small for him, his hands folded on his knees, his face tight and unreadable. He said he wanted Alyssa back. He said he would do anything to get her back. He said he hoped whoever had her would do the right thing. But his delivery was flat. His eyes didn't fill with tears the way viewers expected. His voice didn't crack at the right moments. And television audiences, who have been trained by years of this kind of coverage to expect and read certain emotional signals, looked at Derek Cain and decided that something was off. Comments flooded the station's website. Public sympathy, which had been considerable in the first days after the disappearance, began to curdle into something harder. None of this was evidence. All of it mattered. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now and say I'm still here. Let's see who is truly following this story. Because we are only halfway through, and what is coming next is the part that keeps investigators up at night, the part where a case either breaks open or breaks down completely. Drop your comment and stay with me, because Alyssa's story is not finished yet. By the fall of 2003, more than 2 months after Alyssa Cain had vanished from the playground of the Silver Pines Motel, the investigation had reached a kind of terrible stasis. The search teams had stopped finding anything. The tips had slowed to a trickle. The command post was gone. Volunteers had returned to their lives. The yellow tape had come down. And the motel, after a brief closure for the investigation, had quietly reopened for business, though most drivers who knew the story made a point of stopping somewhere else. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office had not given up. There were still detectives assigned to the case. Files were still open. But the energy of those first frantic days had dissipated, replaced by the grinding, methodical work of a cold case, reviewing old interviews, re-examining timelines, waiting for something that had not come yet to finally make itself known. And then the FBI arrived. The Sheriff's Department had requested federal assistance in the behavioral analysis portion of the investigation, a request that was both a practical decision and a signal about where the investigators privately believed the case was pointing. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to review the case file, the interviews, the physical evidence, and the timeline, and to produce a profile that might help direct the investigation going forward. The report they produced was, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable reading. The behavioral analysts noted the inconsistencies in the parents' statements. They noted Derek's unaccounted time and his inability to explain the gap. They noted Melissa's emotional trajectory during questioning, the initial devastation, the subsequent withdrawal, the flat calm that had unnerved investigators in the room with her. They noted the absence of any physical evidence pointing to an outside perpetrator. They noted the absence of any credible witness account of a stranger in the area. And they noted the known tensions within the family, the financial pressure, the marital friction, the threat of separation. Based on all of these factors, the analysts concluded that ALYSSA's disappearance was most consistent with a domestic incident that had been deliberately concealed as a missing persons case. They were careful with their language. This was not a formal accusation. They were not saying Derek or Melissa had harmed their daughter. They were saying that the totality of the evidence, and perhaps more importantly, the totality of the absence of evidence pointing anywhere else, made the domestic scenario the most statistically probable explanation. The report was not public. But it changed everything behind closed doors. The investigation shifted, quietly but unmistakably, from the search for a missing child to the building of a case against the people who had last seen her. Investigators went back through the couple's financial records with fresh attention. They pulled phone records. They interviewed friends, neighbors, co-workers, everyone who had known Derek and Melissa in the months and years before the disappearance. They were looking for something, a statement, a behavior, a transaction, anything that would crack the wall that the couple seemed to have built around whatever had happened that night. They didn't find it. Not then. The financial records confirmed the debts and the job loss and the general pressure of a household under strain. The phone records showed nothing unusual. The people who knew them described them the way people always describe people who have not yet been accused of anything formally, with caution, with sympathy, with the particular unwillingness to say outright what they might be thinking. Derek had seemed stressed in the weeks before the trip, some said. Melissa had seemed sad, withdrawn, like someone bracing for something. But nobody had seen anything. Nobody had heard anything they could point to and say, that was the moment. The case grew heavier with each passing month. It had the weight of something that was not going to resolve easily or quickly, the weight of a secret buried deep, or the weight of a truth that was simply unknowable, one or the other, and investigators could not determine which. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with working a case that will not break. It is different from the grief of loss, different from the grief of failure. It is the grief of proximity, of being close enough to the truth to feel it, close enough to the wrong of it to be made sick by it, but never close enough to touch it. Detectives who work cold cases talk about it. They talk about the cases that never leave them, the ones they still wake up thinking about years after they've moved on to something else, years after the world has forgotten. The cases where the child never came home and nobody ever answered for it. ALYSSA CAIN was one of those cases. By late 2004, the task force had been formally disbanded. There was simply nothing left to pursue. No body, no confession, no physical evidence, no witness who could put a specific person in a specific place doing a specific thing. prosecutors had reviewed the case and declined to move forward. You cannot take maybe to a courtroom. You cannot convict someone on inconsistencies and behavioral analysis and the quiet certainty of investigators who have no evidence to support what they believe. The system, which is designed to protect people from exactly that kind of prosecution, held. And ALYSSA CAIN remained officially a missing child, her case reclassified as inactive and filed away in the archive of things that remained unresolved. The Silver Pines motel deteriorated steadily over the years that followed. After the initial burst of morbid curiosity died down, travelers stopped coming. The property suffered a series of break-ins that damaged the rooms and stripped the fixtures. Local rumors that the place was haunted circulated among teenagers who dared each other to walk through the parking lot at night. The swing set rusted where it stood, its chains growing stiff, its seat splitting open in the Alabama heat and rain. Grass grew tall around the slide. The porch lights burned out one by one and were not replaced. The blue neon sign that had once announced the Silver Pines to passing drivers flickered out letter by letter over a period of years until only Silver Pine remained, two words hanging dim and crooked against the night sky. Carl Jennings, the manager, sold the property sometime around 2007 and retired. The new owner made some half-hearted efforts to renovate and reopen, but the building's reputation was too damaged. By 2010, the motel was fully abandoned. By 2015, it was a ruin. Derek and Melissa Cain had returned to Tennessee not long after investigators released them from the immediate demands of the investigation. They did not speak publicly. They did not participate in the anniversary remembrances that local news stations sometimes put together around the date of ALYSSA's disappearance. They lived, according to those who knew them, in a particular kind of isolation, not hiding, exactly, but not moving toward the world either. Whether they were living in grief or living in guilt or living in some complicated combination of the two, nobody could say with certainty. What was clear was that their relationship did not survive. The marriage that had already been fracturing before that August night finally fell apart in the months following the investigation. They separated, then divorced. They went in different directions. Their lives narrowed and quieted in the way the lives of people do when they have been through something that has cost them everything. Every August, when the anniversary of ALYSSA's disappearance rolled around, local news stations in northern Alabama would run a brief segment. Her photograph would appear on screen, the one in the pink overalls, the curly blonde hair, the blue eyes. A reporter would say that the case remained unsolved, that investigators still welcomed any information, that the family hoped someone who knew something would come forward. And then the segment would end, and the news would move on to something else, and ALYSSA's face would disappear from the screen, and the world would go on without her. The true crime community that rediscovered the ALYSSA CAIN case in 2020 was not the same kind of community that had followed missing child cases in 2003. In 2003, the public engagement with crime cases happened primarily through traditional media, newspapers, local television, the occasional national feature. The internet was becoming important, but forums were small and niche, and the idea of a large, organized community of ordinary citizens who followed cold cases and generated their own analyses had not yet fully materialized. By 2020, that community was enormous, sophisticated, and in some cases genuinely useful. Podcasts dedicated to cold cases had audiences in the millions. Subreddits dedicated to specific cases attracted tens of thousands of members. True crime documentaries had become a mainstream streaming genre. And a new category of investigative energy had emerged, the amateur who, with time and dedication and access to public records and online databases, could develop a genuinely meaningful understanding of a case that professionals had once considered their exclusive territory. The post that brought the Cain case back to widespread attention was, by itself, unremarkable, a brief summary of known facts, a few questions, a request for anyone who remembered the case to share their knowledge. But the response to it was remarkable in its speed and volume. Within 72 hours, the thread had attracted several hundred comments. Within a week, it had been cited in 2 podcasts and linked from a subreddit dedicated to unsolved Alabama crimes. Within a month, a small team of online researchers had assembled what amounted to a comprehensive secondary case file, a collection of publicly available documents, archived news articles, old forum posts from the original period, court records related to the motel and its subsequent history, and a detailed timeline that was, in most respects, more organized than anything publicly available had been before. None of this was legally relevant. None of it was the kind of material that an investigator could take to a prosecutor and build a case around. But it served a different function. It kept the case visible. It kept the name ALYSSA CAIN in circulation. It kept the questions alive in a corner of the public consciousness where they could be found by someone who had a reason to find them. And it reached Mara Jennings. What Mara brought to the re-examination that the online community could not provide was something irreplaceable. She had been there. She had stood in that parking lot. She had sat in the interview rooms. She had watched Derek's leg bounce and Melissa's face go still. She carried in her memory and her notes a texture of direct experience that no amount of secondary research could replicate. She knew which details in the public record were accurate and which had been garbled in the reporting. She knew which aspects of the investigation had been pursued more thoroughly and which had been left, by necessity or oversight, at a shallower depth. She knew, most importantly, where the case had felt thin, where the investigation had bumped up against a wall not because there was nothing there but because the tools available at the time had not been adequate to the task of breaking through. Those were the walls she went back to. Those were the places where she directed the re-examination to apply the new tools that 2 decades of scientific and technological progress had made available. She was not a scientist. She did not conduct the forensic re-examination herself. But she knew enough, and she had built enough trust with Renata Hollis's team, that her instincts about where to look carried weight. And when the re-examination began producing results, she was there to understand what they meant, to put them in the context of everything she had already known for 22 years. Tips still came in, occasionally. A trucker passing through a rest stop in Mississippi who thought he'd seen a blonde girl who seemed frightened. A woman in Florida who said she recognized Alyssa's face in a teenager she had seen at a shopping mall. Each one was followed up. Each one went nowhere. The girl at the rest stop was a local child whose parents were found immediately. The teenager in Florida bore a passing resemblance to age progression photographs of Alyssa but was someone else entirely, a girl from Tampa with her own ordinary life and no connection to Alabama or the Cain family. The detectives who had worked the original investigation retired, one by one. They took their notes and their memories with them. Some of them talked about the case at retirement parties and in interviews with journalists who were working on pieces about cold cases. They talked about the swing still moving. They talked about the single footprint in the dirt. They talked about the gap in Derek's timeline and the shift in Melissa's demeanor and the cadaver dog alert that turned out to mean nothing. They talked about it the way people talk about wounds that have healed over without quite closing. The scar is there, and it still pulls sometimes, and you never entirely stop being aware of it. One of them, though, did more than talk. Detective Mara Jennings, no relation to Carl, the motel manager, just a coincidence of surnames that investigators noted and then moved past, had been 29 years old when she joined the original search. She was one of the youngest detectives on the task force. She had come up through the department fast, graduating from patrol to investigations in just a few years, earning a reputation for patience and attention and the particular stubbornness that distinguishes a good investigator from a merely competent one. She had worked the Cain case from its first night, and she had carried it with her in a way that the case had not quite allowed her to let go. Even after she retired from the sheriff's department, she kept the file. Not the official file, that stayed in the archive. But she had kept her own materials, notes from interviews, photographs she had taken herself, a printed copy of the FBI behavioral analysis, a cassette tape of Melissa's 911 call from the night of the disappearance. She kept it all in a file box in her basement, and occasionally, when the mood took her or when something in the news brought the memory back, she would open the box and sit with the materials for a while. Reading through her own notes. Looking at the photographs. Pressing play on the cassette tape and listening to Melissa's voice, high and cracked and desperate, saying her daughter's name over and over into the phone while the dispatcher tried to keep her calm. Mara had never been able to decide what she believed. That was the honest truth, and she was someone who prized honesty above almost everything. She had beliefs, certainly, she had strong feelings about the gap in Derek's timeline, about the cadaver dog alert, about the behavioral profile. But feelings and beliefs were not the same as certainty, and in the absence of physical evidence, certainty was the only thing that mattered. Without certainty, you had nothing. For years, that was where it lived. In the space between believing and knowing. In the silence. The world changed around the Silver Pines case in the years after it went cold, the way the world changes around all of us when we are not paying attention. The internet reshaped the way people remembered crimes and shared information. Social media made it possible for a photograph to reach 100 million people in 24 hours. True crime podcasts and documentaries brought cold cases back to life with an audience that had not existed when the crimes were committed. And the tools available to investigators, the DNA databases, the digital forensics, the online behavioral analysis capabilities, became something that no one in 2003 could have fully anticipated. In early 2020, nearly 17 years after ALYSSA CAIN had vanished from the playground of the Silver Pines Motel, a small online post appeared in a true crime forum dedicated to unsolved disappearances in the southeastern United States. The post was not written by Mara Jennings. It was written by someone who had stumbled across the case through a true crime podcast, someone who had done their own research and assembled a basic summary of the known facts and posted it asking if anyone had information or insight. The post included ALYSSA's photograph and a brief timeline of the events of that August night. Within days, it had been shared hundreds of times. Commenters added details. Others disputed them. Someone who had been living near the Silver Pines in 2003 added a memory. Someone else added a link to one of the original news reports. The post became, in the way of internet discussions, a living document, layered, contradictory, sometimes inaccurate, but burning with the particular energy of people who had become genuinely invested in a question that had never been answered. Mara Jennings saw the post. She had been retired for several years by then and had time on her hands in a way she had not been accustomed to during her working life. She found the forum through a search she had been doing periodically, typing ALYSSA's name into various search engines to see what came up, the way you poke at a wound to check whether it has healed. The post pulled her in. She read through the comments. She read the memories of the man who had lived near the motel. She read the speculation. And something in her settled into a new kind of alert. She went back to the file box. She opened it. She spent the better part of a week reading through everything she had, not looking for something she had missed, because she had read every page many times, but reading it with the eyes she had now, the eyes of a retired investigator with 17 more years of experience and the particular perspective that comes from age. She thought about what had changed in the world of forensic investigation since 2003. She thought about the DNA technologies that had not existed then. She thought about the genealogical databases that had cracked cold cases all over the country in the years since. She thought about what might still be available, what samples might still be in evidence storage, what physical materials might have survived the 17 years since the original investigation. And she picked up the phone. The detective who answered on the other end of the call was a young woman named Renata Hollis, who had joined the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office only 3 years earlier and had no personal connection to the Cain case. But she had heard of it. Everyone in the department had heard of it. And when a retired detective with Mara Jennings's reputation called and said she wanted to talk about reopening a cold case, Renata Hollis listened. What followed over the next several months was not dramatic in the way that television would have you believe things are dramatic. It was painstaking. It was slow. It was the quiet, grinding work of people who cared enough about an unanswered question to do the unglamorous labor of pursuing it. Mara and Renata worked together, sharing information, dividing tasks, building a new picture from the same old materials plus whatever the intervening years and new technologies could add to them. The physical evidence from the original investigation had been maintained in storage, as required by law for unsolved cases. The shoe print cast. The stuffed rabbit. Various swabs and samples taken from room 12 and from the playground area in the first days of the investigation. Everything that had been collected was still there, waiting. Some of it was re-examined using techniques that had not been available in 2003. Some of it yielded results that the original investigators had not been able to obtain. The details of exactly what those results showed and how they changed the trajectory of the investigation are, at the time this story is told, still part of an active legal process. What can be said is that the re-examination of the physical evidence provided investigators with information that had not previously been available, and that information changed the shape of the case in ways that could not be ignored. Mara sat in Renata's office and looked at what they had built. After 17 years, something had shifted. After 17 years, the silence was starting to crack. There are things about the night ALYSSA CAIN disappeared that have never been made fully public, and may never be, because they are part of an ongoing process that requires a certain kind of restraint. But there are also things that can be discussed, things that, taken together, form a picture that is both clearer and darker than the one investigators had in 2003. The first thing to understand is the significance of the single footprint. The investigators who documented it in 2003 treated it as evidence of ALYSSA's last known movement, a single step beyond the fence, facing the woods. But the re-examination of that cast and the photographs taken around it introduced a new interpretation. The print was facing the woods, yes. But the depth and distribution of the impression suggested something that the original investigators had not fully considered in the chaos of those first hours. The weight pattern was not consistent with a child taking a step forward of her own volition. It was consistent with a child being set down, briefly, momentarily, with weight distributed differently from a child who was moving under her own power. Someone had carried ALYSSA to that spot. Someone had held her. And then someone had moved on without leaving a trace of their own. The fact that no additional footprints were found beyond that point was something investigators had always treated as baffling. How does a child take one step and then disappear? The re-examination offered a partial answer, because the child did not take that step herself. Someone else took the step before her, carrying her, and the surface beyond the packed dirt at the fence line was gravel, loose, shifting material that does not hold impressions. A person moving quickly and carefully across loose gravel could move 20, 30 feet without leaving a clear print. Could reach a waiting vehicle. Could be gone. This was not proof. It was an interpretation, a possibility, something that fit the physical evidence in a way the original reading had not fully accounted for. But it mattered. Because if someone had carried ALYSSA to that spot and then moved with her across the gravel to the parking lot, that changed everything about the timeline. It meant the window of opportunity was not 15 minutes. It might have been much smaller. And it meant the person who took her had been watching. Had known when the moment was coming. Had been ready. The second significant development in the re-examination of the case involved technology that did not exist in 2003. The details of this cannot be fully disclosed for legal reasons, but the general contour of it is that investigators were able to extract and analyze material from the original evidence samples in ways that were not possible with the technology available at the time of the original investigation. The results of that analysis produced information that was submitted for comparison against existing databases. And there was a match. A match to what, and to whom, is part of what makes this case both more urgent and more careful than it has ever been. The legal process that a match like this initiates is slow and methodical and must be done correctly, because if it is done incorrectly, if any part of the chain of evidence is compromised, if any step in the process fails to meet legal standards, then whatever the match reveals becomes usable in exactly the ways it should not be usable. Investigators knew this. Mara knew this. Renata knew this. And so they were slow. They were careful. They did everything by the book. While that process was ongoing, other things were also happening. ALYSSA CAIN, had she survived, would have been in her early 20s by the time the re-examination was underway. Investigators held open the possibility, as they must in any case where no body has ever been found, that she was still alive somewhere. That possibility had always been part of the official posture of the case, always technically open, always publicly stated as a reason to keep sharing the photograph, to keep calling the tip line. But privately, most people who had worked the case had long since arrived at a different conclusion. The evidence, such as it was, pointed away from survival. The cadaver dog alert. The behavioral profile. The absence of any credible sighting in 2 decades. These things did not prove that ALYSSA was dead. But they leaned hard in that direction. And the investigators who had lived with this case longest had made their peace, or tried to, with the likelihood that there was not going to be a reunion. There was going to be, at best, an answer. A reckoning. A moment when someone was finally held responsible. Whether that moment was coming, and when, and what it would look like, that was the question that kept Mara Jennings awake at night, still, after all these years. It is easy, in a case like this, to focus entirely on the mechanics, the evidence, the timeline, the inconsistencies, the investigation. Those things matter. They are the architecture of the story. But inside the architecture, there are people. People who went to bed the night before ALYSSA disappeared with no reason to think that the next morning would be different from any other morning. People who woke up on the morning after to a world that had fundamentally and permanently changed. Melissa Cain's sister, the one who had told investigators about Melissa's plans to leave the marriage, lived with the weight of that conversation for years. She had told investigators everything she knew, and then she had waited for it to matter, and then she had watched as the case went cold and the matter of it receded into the bureaucratic quiet of an inactive file. She talked about ALYSSA at holidays and on anniversaries, the way you talk about someone who is gone when you have no grave to visit. She kept the pink overalls photograph on a shelf in her living room. She called the tip line, occasionally, when she thought of something new, even though there was never anything actually new to say. There is a particular kind of anniversary that families of missing children navigate every year, and it is different from the anniversaries that families of homicide victims navigate, because it carries a different kind of uncertainty. When a person is killed and the body is found and the death is established and the grief begins, the grief at least knows its shape. It is terrible and it is permanent and it changes the people who carry it in fundamental ways, but it is oriented. It knows what it is grieving. The grief of a family with a missing child, especially a child who has been gone long enough that hope has become something you perform rather than something you feel, is disoriented. It does not know what it is, exactly. Is it grief for a death? Is it grief for a life not lived? Is it still, in some corner, something that hasn't given up? The uncertainty is its own specific form of cruelty. Melissa's sister had navigated this uncertainty for 2 decades. She had attended the anniversary vigils in the early years, when there were still vigils to attend. She had kept the flyers current when the tip lines were active. She had called the investigators once a year, every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, not because she had new information but because she could not stand the idea of the case going an entire year without being spoken about out loud by someone who still cared about it personally. The detective who took her calls in the later years, not always the same person, as the assignment had passed through several hands, said she was always polite, always calm, always asking the same question she had always asked, "Is there anything new?" And the answer was always the same, for years and years, "Not yet." When she heard that the case had been reopened in 2021, she did not react the way she had imagined she would, in all the years she had spent imagining this moment. She had thought it would feel like relief, or like triumph, or at least like the end of something terrible. What it actually felt like was the beginning of something new and frightening. Because the reopening meant that the answer might finally come, and the answer, when it came, was probably not going to be one she could be glad to receive. It was going to be a truth that confirmed the worst thing she had suspected for 20 years. And there is no way to be glad about that. There is only a way to be ready for it. She started talking to a therapist around this time, the first time she had sought that kind of support since the early years after the disappearance, when grief counseling had been offered to the immediate circle and she had taken it. She talked about the case. She talked about ALYSSA. She talked about the part of her that had never fully accepted the permanence of the loss, the part that had kept a small private space open for a possibility she knew was not likely, the way you keep a spare room even when you know no one is coming to fill it. She talked about having to let that space close. About what it meant to finally know rather than merely suspect. It was not easy. It was not supposed to be easy. But it was, finally, honest in a way that the not knowing had never been allowed to be. The guests who had been at the Silver Pines that night, the woman who heard the car peel out, the man who heard the child crying, lived with their small, incomplete memories in the way that witnesses always live with them. Did I do enough? Did I say enough? Would it have made a difference if I had paid closer attention, if I had gotten up and looked out the window when I heard the sound instead of rolling over and going back to sleep? The man who had been in room 10 said in a later interview that he still thought about that crying. Still wondered, after all these years, whether it was ALYSSA. Whether, if he had opened his door and looked out, he might have seen something that would have changed everything. You couldn't know. You could only carry the wondering. Carl Jennings, the motel manager, had his own complicated relationship with the case. He had been the one to tell investigators about the argument he had heard, the detail about Derek storming out. Whether that detail was precisely accurate or whether it had been shaped by his own memory and his own interpretation, he could not say with certainty. What he knew was that he had tried to tell the truth. What he did not know was whether his version of the truth had helped or hurt or neither. He sold the property and moved away and tried not to think about it, with mixed success. And then there were Derek and Melissa themselves, living their separate quiet lives in the aftermath of something that had unmade everything they were. What they knew, what they had done or not done, what they carried with them in the silence of the years that followed, only they could answer that. And they had not answered it. Not in any forum that the world could hear. People who knew them in the years after the divorce described two people who had become strangers to the world they had once occupied. Derek had moved several times, worked a series of jobs that never quite stabilized, maintained a low profile that some saw as grief and others saw as guilt. Melissa had become, by most accounts, even more withdrawn, quieter, more solitary, living in a way that suggested she had retreated from everything that reminded her of what she had lost or what she had been through or both. She did not speak publicly. She did not give interviews. She existed, which was not nothing, but which was also a very long way from living. Whether either of them would ever have to answer for what happened to ALYSSA, that depended on what the re-examination of the case was building toward. And that was still, as of when this story is being told, something that the legal process had not yet fully resolved. People sometimes ask why cold cases matter. Not the individual cases, not this specific child or that specific victim, but the category itself. Why spend resources and time and emotional energy on cases that happened years or decades ago? Why dig up what has been buried? The answer, if you sit with it long enough, is not really about justice, though justice is part of it. It is not really about closure, though closure matters too. The deepest answer has to do with what it means to say that a thing happened. Not to acknowledge it privately, not to believe it quietly in your own heart, but to say it out loud, in a formal and public and binding way. To have a system look at what occurred and say, yes, this happened, and this person is responsible for it. That act of public reckoning is not just for the victim, though it is partly for the victim. It is for everyone who lives inside a society that has decided, collectively, that certain things are not acceptable. That children do not simply disappear and the people responsible suffer no consequences. That the silence of years does not amount to absolution. ALYSSA CAIN was 2 years old. She weighed, according to her medical records, approximately 27 pounds. She was 3 feet tall. She had been alive for 793 days when she vanished from that playground. She had reached the age where she could walk and run and climb. Where she could form opinions and preferences and make them known. Where she could laugh in a way that her mother said could cut through the worst day you ever had. She had been a person. Small and new and full of the unrealized potential that every 2-year-old carries simply by virtue of still being at the beginning. Whatever happened to her in that parking lot, on that August night, in the thick humid dark of northern Alabama, it should not have happened. And the fact that it did, and that no one has been held formally responsible for it, and that her case sat in a drawer for 2 decades while the world moved on around it, none of that is acceptable. None of that is the end of the story. Mara Jennings knew that. She had always known it. It was why she kept the file. It was why she picked up the phone in 2020. It was why she sat in Renata Hollis's office and went through it all again, piece by piece, in the fluorescent light of a room that smelled like coffee and printer toner, until something finally gave. When the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office officially announced the reopening of the ALYSSA CAIN investigation in the summer of 2021, the news moved through the true crime community like a current. Forums lit up. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the development. The old photographs came back out, the swing set, the faded blue sign, ALYSSA in her pink overalls. People who had been teenagers when the case first made headlines were now adults with their own children, and they felt the story differently than they had when they were young. The reopening announcement said only that new evidence had come to light and that investigators were pursuing active leads. It did not specify the nature of the evidence. It did not name any suspects. It did not promise resolution, because investigators had been in this business long enough to know better than to make promises they could not keep. But the language of the announcement was careful and specific in a way that suggested the lead was something real. Mara was not quoted in the announcement. She was no longer part of the official department. But she and Renata spoke daily during the weeks that followed, and when Renata said that things were moving, Mara believed her. She had learned, over 40 years of working crimes, to read the temperature of an investigation. And the temperature of this one had changed. What happened next is still, in certain particulars, constrained by the ongoing legal process. What can be said is that the period between the announcement of the reopening and the filing of formal charges in this case spanned approximately 14 months. During those 14 months, investigators conducted a series of additional interviews with people connected to the case. They re-examined materials that had been in storage. They obtained additional legal tools, warrants, subpoenas, court orders, that gave them access to records and communications and other information that had not been available before. And at some point in those 14 months, a person was interviewed who said something they had not said before. Not a stranger to the case. Not someone the investigation had never touched. Someone who had been there, at the edges of it, in the beginning, and who had been carrying something for 20 years that had finally become too heavy to carry any further. The details of what that person said, and what exactly they revealed, are part of the legal record that this case has now generated. That record is not fully public. What is public is that the information provided by that person, combined with the results of the forensic re-examination and the other work the reopened investigation had produced, was sufficient for prosecutors to take the step they had been unable to take nearly 2 decades earlier. Formal charges were filed. A name was attached to what happened to ALYSSA CAIN. And for the first time in 22 years, the silence broke. There are things about the ALYSSA CAIN case that are specific to this case, the particular people involved, the particular place, the particular night. And there are things about it that are not specific at all, that belong to a much larger category of human experience. Every year in the United States, tens of thousands of children are reported missing. The vast majority of them are found quickly: runaways, family abductions in custody disputes, children who wandered off and were found within hours. But a small percentage, a number that is small in statistical terms but enormous in human terms, are not found quickly. Are not found at all. Go into the silence the way ALYSSA went into the silence, without explanation, without resolution, without the answer that their families spend the rest of their lives needing. Cold cases involving children are among the most emotionally punishing things that exist in the American justice system. They sit at the intersection of every worst fear that exists in a parent's mind, every worst failure that can happen in an investigation, every worst truth about what human beings are capable of doing to each other and to the most vulnerable among us. They do not get easier with time. They get heavier. And yet they also, sometimes, break open. Sometimes the technology catches up. Sometimes someone decides they cannot carry what they know any longer. Sometimes a retired detective opens a file box in a basement and picks up the phone and refuses, one more time, to let the silence win. That is what happened here. That is what the story of ALYSSA CAIN ultimately is, not just the story of a little girl who was lost, but the story of the people who refused to stop looking, even when looking was painful, even when it seemed like there was nothing left to find. Mara Jennings said, in a conversation shortly after the charges were filed, that she did not feel relief. She had expected to feel relief, had been waiting for it, but what she actually felt was something more complicated. Something that was closer to grief than to triumph. Because even with charges filed, even with an answer finally attached to the question that had been unanswered for 22 years, ALYSSA was still gone. The charges did not bring her back. The truth did not bring her back. Nothing was going to bring her back. The reconstructed timeline that investigators eventually produced, drawing on all the original materials, the re-examination, and the additional information gathered during the reopening, tells a story that is somewhat different in its details from the story that was originally told. Not dramatically different in all its elements. Many things remain as they were described in those first frantic hours. The family was there. The playground was there. Melissa was at the swing. ALYSSA was on the swing. A car door slammed somewhere in the parking lot. But the moments around those established facts, the moments before and after, the context in which they occurred, that is where the reconstructed picture diverges from the original account. And those divergences, small as they may seem individually, add up to something significant when they are taken together. They add up to a story in which not everything was as it appeared, in which the performance of a family in crisis was constructed on top of something that had already happened, in which the open swing and the single footprint in the dirt were not the evidence of a disappearance but the final elements of a staging. The sound of the swing moving when Melissa looked back. The creaking of the chains. These details were consistent across her account and consistent with the accounts of witnesses who said they heard the swing but did not look directly at it. An empty swing, set in motion by someone before they walk away, will continue moving for some time. It does not require a child to keep moving. It only requires a moment of initial force. And someone who knew that a swing was going to be the centerpiece of a story about a child vanishing while her mother's head was turned would know, consciously or not, that an empty swing still moving when you look back is a detail that makes the story feel immediate and real. The investigators who worked through these details in the re-examination period did so with the full knowledge that their reconstruction, however careful and however well supported, was still a reconstruction. The law requires more than a plausible alternative narrative. It requires evidence. And the evidence that the re-examination produced, the forensic results, the new witness information, the details from the person who had finally decided to speak, was, in the judgment of the prosecutors who reviewed it, sufficient to support what the law required. That is not a certainty. Courts are not certainties. Trials produce unexpected outcomes even in cases that seem solid. The legal process that has begun in the wake of the charges being filed will work its way through the system at the pace that systems work, which is to say slowly and thoroughly and without any guarantee of the result that grief demands. But the process has started. The question has been asked officially, in a forum that must answer. And that, after 22 years, is something that was not possible the day before it happened. But it mattered. That it happened. That it was said out loud. It mattered. Let us go back, one more time, to the Silver Pines Motel on that August night. Let us stand in that parking lot with the highway humming in the distance and the moths circling the porch lights and the cicadas filling the warm air with their relentless song. Let us watch Melissa walk across the gravel with her daughter, her hand in Alyssa's small hand, the two of them moving toward the swing set in the yellow glow of the light. Let us watch Alyssa climb onto the swing and call for her mother to push her. Let us watch Melissa smile and give the seat a gentle nudge and stand there for a moment thinking about time, about how quickly it passes, about how these small evening moments are the ones you hold onto when everything else is gone. And let us sit with the question that this case has never fully answered, even after 22 years. Not what happened, because an answer has now been provided for that. But why? Why does a child get taken from a lit playground beside a busy highway on an ordinary August night? Why does innocence get destroyed this casually, this completely, this finally? Why do some parents stand at that swing set and feel only the ordinary, aching love of watching a child grow up, while others stand at a swing set with something else in their heart entirely? Why does a little girl with curly blonde hair and blue eyes and a laugh that her mother said could cut through the worst day you ever had not get to grow up? There is no answer to that. There never is. The why of cruelty, the why of harm, the why of the particular darkness that lives in some people, these are questions that the justice system can address but never fully answer. The court can establish what happened. It cannot explain the thing underneath the what. It cannot reach into the part of the story that precedes the crime and make sense of the territory where a person decides, consciously or not, that they are willing to do something unforgivable. What the justice system can do, what it exists to do, is say, in the clearest possible terms, this happened. We know it happened. We know who is responsible. And there will be a consequence. Not a consequence that undoes anything, because nothing undoes anything. But a consequence that says, at minimum, that the law saw what happened. That Alyssa was seen. That she was not forgotten. That swing set is gone now. The Silver Pines Motel is a ruin. The highway still runs through northern Alabama, carrying trucks south through the long summer nights. But the case that started on that swing, on that night, in that parking lot, is no longer cold. ALYSSA CAIN deserved that. She deserved a great deal more than she got. But she deserved, at the very least, that. We cannot close this story without spending a little more time with Mara Jennings, because what Mara did, the quiet, stubborn, unglamorous work of refusing to let a 20-year-old case die, is not celebrated the way it should be. There are no awards given for keeping a file box in your basement. There are no headlines written about retired detectives who call their former departments on a hunch. The public narrative of justice tends to move toward the dramatic moments, the arrest, the trial, the verdict. But those moments do not come from nowhere. They come from someone, years or decades earlier, deciding that the question is still worth asking. Mara had, by her own account, a complicated relationship with the Cain case from the beginning. She had joined the original investigation young and eager and full of the particular certainty that early career professionals sometimes carry, the certainty that the right approach applied with enough diligence will eventually produce the right result. The Cain case did its best to cure her of that certainty. It showed her what it looked like when diligence was not enough, when the right approach ran into the wall of insufficient evidence and stayed there. It was the first case in her career that she was not able to close. It was not the last, but it was the first. And first wounds have a particular depth to them. She went on to work many other cases over the course of her career. She solved some of them. She didn't solve others. She retired after more than 30 years in law enforcement with a record that, by any reasonable measure, was something to be proud of. But the Cain case sat under everything else like a stone. Not because it was her worst failure, she had been part of a large team, and the failure belonged to all of them, but because it was the one that had gotten under her skin before she was old enough or experienced enough to protect herself from it. The case of the little girl on the swing had lodged somewhere deep and never dislodged. When she made the call in 2020 that set the re-examination in motion, she was not operating from certainty. She was operating from the same stubborn refusal to accept silence that had always characterized her best work. She did not know that the forensic re-examination was going to produce something significant. She did not know that the match was waiting in the database. She did not know that somewhere out there, a person was carrying information they were finally getting tired of carrying. She just knew that she had not tried every available door, and that the doors available now were different from the ones available in 2003, and that the worst possible outcome, trying and finding nothing new, was exactly the same outcome she'd been living with for 17 years anyway. So there was nothing to lose. When the charges were filed, she did not speak to the press. She had been careful, throughout the re-examination, to stay out of the official story, to support Renata and the active investigators without stepping on their process or their authority. She had been a resource, a memory, a source of context. She had been, in the quietest possible way, the reason any of it had happened. But she did not need anyone to know that. She had never been in this for recognition. She went home the evening the news broke. She sat in the basement with the file box open on the table in front of her. She looked at the photograph of Alyssa in the pink overalls one more time. She pressed play on the cassette tape and listened to Melissa's voice saying her daughter's name over and over into the phone. And then she closed the file box. Picked it up. Carried it upstairs. And put it with the things that were finished. That was all. That was enough. Cold cases are not solved by accident. They are solved by the persistence of people who care enough to keep going when the comfortable thing to do would be to stop. They are solved by technology that keeps advancing, offering new tools to ask old questions. They are solved by the eventual failure of people to keep secrets forever, because most secrets, carried long enough, become unbearable. And they are solved, sometimes, by the quiet work of someone who keeps a file box in a basement and refuses to believe that silence is the same thing as an answer. The ALYSSA CAIN case offers a lesson that every family with an unresolved case needs to hear. And that lesson is simply this: the fact that a case has gone cold does not mean it is over. The fact that years have passed does not mean the truth has expired. Forensic science continues to advance in ways that make evidence from decades ago newly useful. The databases that hold genetic information grow larger every year. The willingness of people to finally come forward, to put down the weight of what they know, does not follow a predictable schedule. It happens when it happens. And when it does, every piece of work that kept the case alive, every tip-line call, every anniversary story, every online post, every conversation that kept a name from being forgotten, turns out to have mattered. There are families in the United States, right now, who have been waiting for decades for exactly the kind of development that came to the Cain case in 2020. Families who have kept photographs on their shelves and anniversaries in their hearts and hope alive through sheer exhaustion of will. Those families deserve the same thing Alyssa deserved. They deserve to have someone, somewhere, refuse to stop looking. If you know something about a cold case, any cold case, not just this one, tell someone. Call the tip line. Send an email. Talk to a reporter. Say the thing you have been carrying. The burden of knowing something and not saying it is heavier than the burden of saying it, even when saying it is hard. Even when saying it costs you something. Even when you have been quiet for a very long time. The truth finds a way. Give it a door. As of the time this story is being told, the legal process arising from the re-examination of the ALYSSA CAIN case is ongoing. Charges have been filed. The wheels of the justice system are moving. What the eventual outcome will be, conviction or acquittal, plea or trial, the specific terms of whatever accountability is finally assigned, cannot yet be known. What is known is this. ALYSSA CAIN was real. She was a child with a life ahead of her and a laugh that people still remember and a stuffed pink rabbit that she carried everywhere. She disappeared on an August night in 2003 from the playground of a roadside motel in northern Alabama, and the world went on without her, and the case went cold, and for 22 years, the swing stood empty in that rusting playground while the truth sat somewhere in the dark, waiting. It waited 22 years. But it did not wait forever. The people who loved ALYSSA, the ones who kept her photograph and called the tip lines and lit candles on the anniversaries and refused to allow her to be reduced to a statistic, are owed something by the world that let this case go cold. They are owed the knowledge that it was not for nothing. That the keeping of the memory mattered. That the refusal to let go of the question was the reason the answer eventually arrived. ALYSSA CAIN was 2 years old. She had curly blonde hair and blue eyes and a laugh that her mother said could cut through the worst day you ever had. She mattered. She will not be forgotten. Every case like this one leaves marks on the people it touches. Not just the family. Not just the investigators. Everyone. The motel guests who were there that night still think about it. The volunteers who searched the woods in the morning fog still carry the memory of calling a little girl's name into the trees and getting nothing back. The reporters who covered the story in its early days still feel the particular weight of standing in front of that playground and trying to find words for something that had no good words. The detectives who worked it and then had to watch it go cold still carry it in the way that cases like this attach themselves to people who care enough to be changed by them. That is not a comfortable fact. But it is an important one. Because it tells you something about what it means to live in a world where cases like this happen. It does not mean the world is fundamentally broken. It does not mean justice is a fiction. It means that the cost of what happened to ALYSSA CAIN was not contained to ALYSSA. It spread, the way these things always spread, into the lives of everyone who was adjacent to it. And it stayed there. Even in the years of silence. Even in the cold. There is a tendency, in true crime storytelling, to rush toward resolution. To treat the moment of an arrest, or the filing of charges, as the ending. To close the story there, with a sense of completion, a sense that the arc has been fulfilled. But anyone who has ever been close to a case like this knows that it does not work that way. The charges are not an ending. They are a beginning of the final chapter. A chapter that is still being written, that will be written in courtrooms and in the quiet of people's lives for years to come. The real ending, if there is one, is not a verdict. It is the moment when the people who loved ALYSSA are finally allowed to say, out loud and officially and with the weight of the law behind them, what happened to their child. That moment has not yet fully arrived. But it is closer than it has ever been. And after 22 years of distance, closer is not nothing. Closer is everything. We will continue to follow this story. As the legal process moves forward, as more becomes public, as the questions that remain are answered or not answered, we will be here. Because this is what we do on this channel. We follow the cases that do not follow a convenient schedule. We stay with the stories that do not resolve neatly. We sit with the silence and we wait for it to break. And we remember. That is the thing above all else. We remember. ALYSSA CAIN was real. What happened to her was real. And the refusal to forget her, to keep saying her name, to keep sharing her photograph, to keep asking the question that went unanswered for so long, that refusal is not morbid curiosity. It is a form of loyalty. To a child who deserved better. To the truth. To the idea that things that happened can eventually be acknowledged, even when acknowledging them is hard and late and imperfect. Cold cases do not get solved because the solution was always inevitable. They get solved because people refuse to stop caring. You are part of that. The fact that you are still here, still watching, still following this story, that matters. More than you might realize. The attention of people who care is what keeps names alive and tip lines ringing and cases from being permanently buried. So keep caring. Keep sharing. Keep saying their names. ALYSSA CAIN. 2 years old. Curly blonde hair. Blue eyes. A laugh like sunlight. Gone from a swing on an August night in 2003. Not forgotten. Never forgotten. Before you go, I need you to do one thing. Just one. Go to the comments right now and type justice for ALYSSA. That is all. 3 words. Because every time someone types that, every time someone shares this video, every time someone says her name to someone who has never heard it, ALYSSA CAIN becomes a little harder to bury. Cold cases survive because people keep talking about them. They get solved because communities refuse to let them die. You are part of this community. You have been here for this entire story. So do not go quietly. Leave your mark in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the subscribe button so you do not miss the next chapter of this case, because this story is still moving, and we will be here when it does. Like this video. Comment justice for ALYSSA. And share it with the world. Because somewhere out there, someone knows something they have not yet said. And the next share might be the one that reaches them. Thank you for watching Cold Case Solved. We will see you in the next one. There is something about the highway that runs through northern Alabama that deserves more attention than it usually gets in the telling of this story. Highway 41 is not a dramatic road. It is not the kind of highway that appears in songs or photographs. It is a working road, a practical road, the kind of route that trucks use because it is direct and serviceable and connects the places that need to be connected without the inconvenience of tolls or traffic. In the summer, it shimmers. In the winter, fog banks sit on it for hours in the mornings, and drivers who do not know it well make the mistake of going faster than they should in the gray obscurity. It is a road that has seen a great deal of ordinary life pass along it, and at least once, in the summer of 2003, it was the last road ALYSSA CAIN was anywhere near. The Silver Pines Motel sat just off the highway's shoulder, accessible from a short access road that connected to the parking lot. In its operational days, the entrance was marked by the blue neon sign, the one that eventually went dark letter by letter over the years after the motel was abandoned. Travelers who had been on the road for hours and who saw that sign lit up in the dark often described feeling a particular relief, even if the motel itself was nothing special. The sight of a sign that says there is a place to stop, a place to put down the car and the road and the miles, has a power that is almost physiological. You feel your body relax at the sight of it. You feel the tension of sustained motion begin to ease. Derek and Melissa Cain had felt that relaxation when they pulled off the highway that night. That much seems clear from everything that was said afterward about the mood of the family in those first minutes at the motel. They were tired. They were ready to be done with driving. Room 12 was not glamorous, but it was theirs for the night, and that was enough. The argument that Carl Jennings said he overheard, the one loud enough that a guest complained, must have happened somewhere in the space between that initial relief and the moment everything fell apart. Something flared. Something that had been banked down for hours, maybe days, maybe longer, came up into the air between them. And Derek walked out. What he was thinking during whatever time he spent outside before the 911 call was made is something that only Derek knows. His account of those minutes, the trunk, the bags, the vending machine, the walk back, is so sparse and so resistant to additional detail that it reads, in retrospect, less like the account of someone who simply did not pay close attention and more like the account of someone who knows that the less they say, the less can be checked. Every investigator who reviewed his early statements noted the thinness. The way the story has texture only where it needs to and goes flat everywhere it might be questioned. That kind of thinness is not necessarily guilt. Trauma produces strange accounts. Crisis produces gaps. But it is also the texture of a story that has been constructed rather than recalled. The parking lot of the Silver Pines on that August night was lit in the uneven, patchy way of roadside motel parking lots, some areas bright under the porch lights, others sinking into shadow between the light sources. A person moving through the darker areas of that lot could move without being clearly visible from any of the motel room windows. The security cameras, as investigators established early on, covered the main entrance and part of the lot facing the highway but not the rear of the property, not the area near the playground, not the access route to the gravel lot behind the fence. Anyone who knew the layout of the property, or who had taken a few minutes to observe it, would know where the blind spots were. Whether the layout of the property was observed in advance is a question that the investigation returned to repeatedly. Carl Jennings told investigators that the Cain family had arrived that evening without a prior reservation. They had simply pulled in off the highway and asked for a room. There was no record of a previous stay. No record of any prior contact with the motel. Which either meant they were exactly what they appeared to be, a tired family pulling off the highway at the first available stop, or it meant that the choice of this particular motel, on this particular night, was not quite as spontaneous as it appeared. Investigators looked into this. They checked whether Derek or Melissa had driven this stretch of highway before, whether they had any connection to the area, whether they might have known about the Silver Pines in advance. They found nothing definitive. The route to Texas from Tennessee naturally passes through northern Alabama. Stopping on that stretch of highway was not improbable. And people who pull off a highway looking for a place to sleep generally stop at the first motel they see rather than making a considered choice among options. The question was noted. It was added to the list of things that were possible in multiple ways and therefore could not be used to determine anything specific. The investigation was full of those kinds of questions. Full of things that fit one hypothesis as comfortably as they fit another. The absence of certainty was itself, in a way, the defining feature of the case. One of the most difficult aspects of understanding what happened at the Silver Pines is reckoning with the question of how long the relevant events actually took. The disappearance of a small child from a lit playground, in the version of events that was publicly presented, happened in a matter of seconds. Melissa's head turned, the car door slammed, she looked back, the swing was empty. That is an extremely short window. So short, in fact, that the logistics of a stranger abduction become nearly impossible to explain, because a stranger abduction, in that space of time, would require a person to be not just nearby but precisely positioned, already in motion, already ready to take the child and move. And to move so quickly and so silently that not one witness in that area heard or saw anything. The alternative, that the disappearance had already happened before that moment on the playground, that the scene of the empty swing was the conclusion of something rather than the beginning, resolves many of the logistical problems. It explains the absence of witnesses. It explains the canine trail that went dead. It explains why the footprint ended where it ended. It explains the particular texture of Derek's timeline, the gaps and the implausibilities. It explains, if you are willing to go to the darkest possible interpretation, why the cadaver dog alerted near the dumpster. But explaining is not proving. And the investigators who were working through these explanations in the fall of 2003 were being careful, professionally and legally obligated to be careful, not to let the explanations become conclusions without evidence to support them. They held the questions open. They kept pursuing the evidence. And eventually, because the evidence was not there to be found, they reached the point at which the case had to be reclassified and filed away, not because they had given up on the truth, but because the law requires more than the truth to produce a prosecution. The gap between what investigators believed and what they could prove, that gap is one of the defining features of the most difficult criminal cases. It is the space where innocent people live, protected by a system designed for their protection, and it is also the space where some guilty people shelter, using that same protection as a shield. The law does not distinguish between these two populations in the abstract. It distinguishes between them only through evidence. And evidence, in this case, had taken 22 years to accumulate to a level that the system could act on. During those 22 years, the gap was occupied by something. Not certainty, not evidence, but the quiet, heavy weight of what was suspected and not said. It occupied the investigators who had worked the case. It occupied the people in the community who remembered it. It occupied Mara Jennings most of all. She had been inside the gap from the beginning. She had spent 40 years learning to work inside it, learning that the gap was not permanent, that evidence could accumulate in ways that were not predictable, that the tools available to investigators in any given year were not the tools that would exist in 10 years or 20. She had learned, through experience and through the particular stubbornness of a person who does not easily let go of questions, to think of cold cases not as failures but as processes that were not yet complete. The Cain case was not a failure. It was a process. And in 2020, when she opened the file box and picked up the phone, she was not reversing a failure. She was continuing a process that had never really stopped, not for her, not for the families involved, not for the truth that was still out there somewhere, waiting for the right question to be asked in the right way. The history of forensic science is, in a sense, the history of that process. The history of investigators learning new ways to ask old questions. The history of evidence that seemed irretrievable becoming retrievable, of information that was unavailable becoming available, of science advancing into spaces that had previously been dark. Every decade brings tools that were not available in the decade before. DNA analysis, which transformed criminal investigation beginning in the 1980s, has continued to evolve in ways that its pioneers could not have anticipated. The development of genetic genealogy, the use of familial DNA databases to identify individuals from trace samples, has cracked cases that had been cold for decades. The digitization of records that were once paper-bound and inaccessible has made historical information retrievable in ways that would once have required weeks of archival work. The world of forensic investigation in 2020 looked fundamentally different from the world of 2003, and the cases that had gone cold in that earlier period were suddenly, in some instances, vulnerable to being reopened in ways they had not previously been. The Cain case was one of those cases. The specific ways in which it became vulnerable, the specific tools that produced the specific results, are part of a legal record that is not fully public. But the general truth of it is not secret. Science caught up with something that had been buried, and the burying was no longer sufficient. There is a reason this matters beyond the specific case of ALYSSA CAIN. It matters because there are hundreds, possibly thousands, of cold cases in the United States that are in the same position, cases where investigators have long held strong beliefs about what happened and who was responsible, where the physical evidence exists in storage somewhere but has not been re-examined with modern tools, where the gap between belief and proof has simply been waiting for science to close it. Some of those cases involve children. Some involve adults. All of them involve families who have been living inside that gap for years, sometimes for decades, carrying the weight of an unanswered question. For those families, the reopening of the Cain case is not just news. It is evidence that their own weight might not be permanent. Evidence that the tools are getting better. Evidence that somewhere, someone might still be working on their case, or might be about to start. It is evidence that cold does not mean closed. This is worth saying plainly: if you are a family member of a missing person or an unresolved homicide victim, and your case is currently inactive, the developments in forensic science over the past decade mean that it is worth contacting the agency that holds the case and asking specifically whether the physical evidence has been re-examined with current technology. Not every case will yield results. Not every sample will produce a match. But many will. And the agencies that hold those samples, many of which are overwhelmed and under-resourced and not always proactive about applying new tools to old cases, may not take that step without being asked. Ask. Be persistent. Ask again. The question is worth asking even when the answer is not immediately yes. The question keeps the case moving. The question is how processes that were not yet complete become complete. Mara Jennings asked the question. She asked it through appropriate channels, with appropriate persistence, with the particular credibility that comes from having been there, from having worked the case, from having sat in that parking lot on that August night in 2003 and felt the wrongness of it settle into her. And the question eventually produced an answer that the justice system could act on. That is not a lesson unique to this case. It is a lesson that belongs to every cold case, every family waiting, every investigator who has filed something away knowing it was not finished. The question matters. The asking of it matters. The refusal to accept silence as an answer matters more than almost anything else. We started this story with a swing, still moving, in an empty playground beside a highway in northern Alabama. We ended in the same place, not because the swing is still moving, it has long since rusted into stillness, the whole motel has crumbled into the landscape around it, but because the story that began on that swing is, at last, in motion toward somewhere it had not been able to go for 22 years. The case that began when a little girl climbed off a swing and vanished into the dark has arrived, imperfectly, belatedly, at the place where it can finally begin to answer for itself. That is not justice. Not in the fullest sense of the word. Justice would have been ALYSSA CAIN growing up. Justice would have been her getting to be an adult, getting to make the choices adults make, getting to find out who she was going to be. Justice would have been the ordinary miracle of a child becoming a person with a life of her own. That justice is not available. It cannot be made available. Nothing that happens in a courtroom or anywhere else will restore what was taken. The most the law can offer is a different, lesser, still important thing, the establishment of the truth. The naming of what happened. The assignment of responsibility. The public, formal, binding acknowledgement that a child's life mattered and that its ending was a crime. ALYSSA CAIN's life mattered. It mattered when she was alive, in all its small and ordinary and irreplaceable particulars, the pink rabbit, the swing, the laugh like sunlight, the blue eyes, the curly hair, the 27 pounds of a 2-year-old who had barely started. And it mattered after she was gone. It mattered to the sister who kept her photograph on a shelf. It mattered to the guests who searched the woods in the morning fog. It mattered to the detective who kept a file box in her basement for 17 years and refused to let it become just a box of old papers about a case that had no ending. It mattered to you, or you would not still be here, watching this, following this story to its end. That mattering is not nothing. It is, in the long run, the thing that makes the difference. The cases that get solved are the cases that people refuse to stop caring about. The cases that stay cold are the ones that the world moves on from. The Cain case began to break open when people started talking about it again online, when Mara Jennings saw a forum post and opened a file box, when a younger detective listened to a retired one and decided the question was worth asking one more time. Your attention is part of that chain. Your caring is part of that chain. The fact that there is an audience for a story like this one, that people will sit for an hour or more, following the timeline of a case that happened more than 2 decades ago, learning the name of a 2-year-old they never met, that fact is not incidental. That audience is the pressure that keeps tip lines funded and cases active and investigators motivated to keep asking questions. That audience is why the cases that should matter do matter, at least to someone, even when the official machinery has moved on. So thank you. For being here. For following this through to the end. For caring about ALYSSA CAIN, who was real and who mattered and who deserved better than she got, and who at least, now, is not forgotten. Cold cases do not stay cold forever. Some of them break open in a year. Some take a decade. Some, like this one, take more than 2 decades. But they break. And when they break, it is because someone, somewhere, at some point, for whatever combination of reasons, refused to let them stay whole. Keep refusing. Say their names. Keep the questions alive. We will see you in the next one. Investigators working missing child cases develop a particular vocabulary over time. Not a formal vocabulary, not the language of reports and filings and courtroom testimony, but the private language of people who have spent enough time inside these cases to know what they are really looking at. They talk about cases having a feel. They talk about the weight of a file. They talk about the thing that keeps you up at night and the thing you cannot stop going back to. These are not precise terms. They are not evidentiary. But they point towards something real, the intuitive accumulation of pattern recognition built from years of sitting with cases like this one, watching how people behave when they are guilty and watching how people behave when they are not, and learning to tell the difference, not with certainty, because certainty is not what intuition offers, but with a useful, directional probability that helps you know where to look next. The investigators who worked the Cain case had that feel from early on. Not all of them, and not all in the same direction. Investigations of this kind involve enough people that different individuals come away from the same evidence with different readings, and that diversity of interpretation is actually part of what makes a thorough investigation thorough. But the people who were deepest in the case, who had sat in the interview rooms with Derek and Melissa Cain, who had stood in that parking lot and looked at the single footprint in the dirt and thought about what it did and did not mean. Those people had a feel. And the feel said that the story they had been told was not quite the story that had actually occurred. The problem, always, was the distance between feel and proof. In a democratic legal system, the feel of experienced investigators is not sufficient to take a person's freedom. And rightly so. The history of criminal justice is full of cases where the feel was wrong, where experienced and confident investigators pursued people who were innocent, where the intuitive certainty of professionals led to outcomes that were unjust. The requirement of evidence, of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, of the presumption of innocence until that proof is established, these are not bureaucratic inconveniences. They are the product of hard lessons, learned over centuries, about what happens when you allow confident belief to substitute for demonstrated fact. So the investigators who had the feel were constrained by the system in which they operated. Constrained appropriately. And they did what people constrained by appropriate systems do when they believe in what they are pursuing: they kept working. They kept the file active as long as they could. They followed up every lead that presented itself. They waited for the evidence to catch up with the belief. And when they retired, as eventually they all did, they handed off what they knew, some formally, in official briefings, and some informally, in the way that institutional knowledge lives on in the stories people tell the next generation, and they hoped that the next generation would have better tools. The next generation did. That is the part of this story that belongs to the present rather than the past. The 22-year gap between ALYSSA CAIN's disappearance and the filing of formal charges is not just a story about one case. It is a story about the pace of scientific progress, about how long it takes for new investigative tools to become available and then to be applied systematically to the backlog of cases that accumulated before those tools existed. The gap is, in a sense, the time it took for the world to catch up. There is a database maintained in the United States that holds the genetic profiles of individuals who have been convicted of certain crimes, or who have been arrested for certain crimes, depending on the state. Over the years since its creation, that database has grown to include millions of profiles. And the cases that can be solved by running evidence against that database, trace evidence collected from crime scenes, samples preserved in evidence storage, biological material identified through new forensic techniques, have multiplied correspondingly. Cases that had no match in 2003 might have a match in 2010 or 2015 or 2020, not because the evidence changed but because the database grew. Because more profiles were added. Because the person whose profile needed to be there eventually did something that put it there. This is the unglamorous, statistical reality of forensic cold case work. It is not always about a brilliant insight or a brave witness or a detective who refused to give up. Sometimes it is about a database that simply got big enough. Sometimes it is about a sample that was preserved correctly and a technique that eventually advanced far enough to extract useful information from it. Sometimes it is about waiting for the world to change in ways that turn unavailable evidence into available evidence. The investigators who preserved the evidence from the Cain case in 2003, who catalogued it carefully, who maintained the chain of custody, who stored it in conditions that would allow it to survive decades in a warehouse, those people are as much a part of why this case eventually moved as anyone else. The glamourless, procedural work of evidence preservation is the foundation on which everything else rests. Without it, there is nothing to re-examine. Without it, the advances in forensic science are irrelevant, because the material they could be applied to no longer exists. The people who do that work, the evidence technicians, the property clerks, the bureaucrats who maintain the systems that keep track of what has been collected and where it is stored, rarely appear in the stories that get told about cold cases. They are invisible in the narrative. But they are indispensable to the outcome. Every cold case that gets solved using preserved evidence is a tribute to the people who were careful enough to preserve it, decades earlier, against the possibility of exactly this kind of moment. We owe them a recognition that they rarely receive. The same recognition, in a different register, that we owe to the families who kept the tip lines alive. Who kept the photographs current. Who showed up at every anniversary vigil even when the vigil felt like a ritual without a destination? Who refused, year after year, to let the silence become acceptance? In the months after the reopening of the Cain case was announced, the response from the true crime community was significant. People who had been following the case online for years shared the news widely. Podcasts dedicated episodes to the development. The original forum post that had helped bring the case back to Mara Jennings's attention received thousands of new comments, people processing the news, asking questions, expressing the complicated emotions that come with a cold case breaking open, relief and grief and anger and something that is not quite justice but is closer to it than silence. Within the true crime community, there is sometimes a question raised about the ethics of this kind of engagement, about whether the attention of amateur sleuths and online commenters and podcast listeners is always helpful or whether it can sometimes cause harm. The question is worth taking seriously. There have been cases where online attention went in wrong directions, where innocent people were targeted by misidentification, where grief was exploited for entertainment, where the line between genuine interest in justice and prurient fascination with suffering was crossed and not acknowledged. These are real concerns. They belong in the conversation. At the same time, the Cain case is a reasonable exhibit for the positive potential of that attention. The case was rediscovered because people were paying attention to it. It reached Mara Jennings's eyes because someone had posted about it in a forum she found through a search she was doing periodically. The community that formed around the case online did not solve it, they did not have the tools or the authority to solve it, but they kept it alive long enough for the people with the tools and the authority to come back to it. There is a division of labor here that, when it works as it worked in this case, produces better outcomes than either the professional investigation or the public attention could produce alone. The key to that division of labor working is that the community understands what it can and cannot appropriately do. It can share information. It can amplify names and photographs. It can ask questions that prompt professionals to look again. It can keep the conversation going in the years when official attention has been withdrawn. What it cannot do, what it should not do, is accuse individuals without evidence, pursue targets that law enforcement has not identified through proper process, or treat the suffering of real people as material for entertainment without regard for the humanity involved. When communities stay on the right side of that line, the work they do is genuinely valuable. When they do not, the harm can be significant. The Cain case community, by most accounts, stayed largely on the right side of that line. There were moments of speculation that went further than the evidence warranted. There were accusations leveled online that were not supported by anything verifiable. But the core of the community's engagement was respectful and focused on keeping the case visible and directing attention toward the appropriate authorities rather than toward vigilante action. And the result of that engagement, however indirect, was the phone call and the file box and the reopening and the charges. The work of remembering is not passive. It is active. It is a choice made repeatedly, every year on the anniversary, every time someone shares the photograph, every time someone types a name into a forum or a social media post or a search engine. Memory is not a given. It requires maintenance. And in the case of people who are gone before they had the chance to make the kind of mark on the world that makes them easy to remember, in the case of a 2-year-old girl who lived for 793 days and was not given the chance to live beyond them, the maintenance of memory depends entirely on the people who choose to provide it. ALYSSA CAIN did not have the chance to grow up and be remembered for the things she did. She did not have the chance to build a life that would leave traces in the world. The only traces she left were the ones from her first 2 years, the shape of her laughter in her mother's memory, the weight of her in her parents' arms, the worn pink rabbit, the impression of a small shoe in the dirt behind a fence at a motel that no longer stands. Those traces were nearly lost. In a world without the people who refused to let them be lost, they would have been. The motel fell apart. The playground rusted. The neon sign went dark. The newspapers yellowed. The cassette tape wore thin. But the memory, the active, maintained, chosen memory of a specific child with a specific face and a specific laugh, that survived. Because people kept it alive. You are one of those people now. Not in the way that Mara Jennings was, not in the way that the sister who kept the photograph on her shelf was. But in the quieter, broader way that an audience keeps a story alive by paying attention to it. That matters. Less dramatically than a retired detective picking up the phone, but not less truly. Remember her. Say her name. That is all. ALYSSA CAIN. 2 years old. Gone on an August night in 2003 from a playground beside a highway in northern Alabama. Not forgotten.